Chapter 3. In Mecca during the Emir's absence. There is so much room for exhibition of taste in the way of personal adornment about the Eastern dress that I defy the most simple-minded of men to don a turban or cummerbund without bringing into play a little vanity. For my part, I became quite an Eastern swell, my tunic of the whitest, my turban of the largest and brightest, and besides, I felt myself to be rather an important personage, a householder, and possibly entitled to a vote for a Kossi, though I did not test my rights to any great extent in this way. The idea of any rowdy Arab questioning me as to who I was never for a moment entered into my calculations. I swaggered about the streets anywhere and everywhere, but I was doomed to be let down in a manner that rather astonished my weak nerves. One day I was passing a large college on the outskirts of the town under the leave. The grace of God d his blessings, d.d., when the students, about 150, of all ages from 5 to 15, were out playing. I stayed to look on at their various games, such as marbles, not unlike the English game, as far as I could see. One little group had an old pistol, snapping caps, and altogether I was much amused watching them, when a little Hindi child near me shouted, "Oh, look at the Christian!" I shall never be able to guess what put it into that son of Iblis's head. Perhaps he had seen Englishmen in India, and was struck with a fancied resemblance, or it may have been only for fun, though Eastern children are not generally given to unprovoked mischief. Up to this nothing of the kind had happened to me, and as it was unexpected it took me very much aback. It also collected all the young imps in the neighborhood, who took up the cry, and one great hulking brute stepped up to me and said, in a blustering manner, "Christian dog, if you are a Mohammedan, make the profession of your faith." Now I am one of the most peacefully disposed of men, as Jack says, I would rather run a mile than fight a minute, yet all my life I have been getting dragged into fights. I suppose I must look like a fellow easily put upon, whereas I have a Badawi aversion to dirt as an article of diet. This beggar riled me, and I did not feel at all disposed to give an account of myself to him. No, I just took the fellow by the shoulders, turned him round and administered a kick in the rear that must have made him see stars. Now, I do suppose I could not have perpetrated a more Mohammedan act. Instead of seizing the opportunity to deliver myself of profuse expressions of devotion and faith, as a Mohammedan does on the slightest provocation, I had offered to my very proper interrogator one of the greatest indignities possible to a Mohammedan. I had struck him with a shoe. It brought a yell of "Y.A. Christian" from its recipient, taken up by the whole crew. I had put my foot in it, had been taken off my guard, and now saw things could not be mended, so turned round and attempted to make a dignified retreat, when, close past my ear flew a blue object, a pigeon I thought, but it lit a few feet ahead with a clatter that showed the kind of blue rock it was, and another asterisk I have eaten dirt, that is, taken an insult. Followed, fetching me one on the skull, that would have settled the number of my mess, but for the thickness of my too attractive headdress. These Meccan youths living, so to speak, on a stone heap, get, from constant practice, to be able to deliver a stone as straight and almost as hard as a pistol shot. I looked round an instant, and saw that the whole swarm had entered into the holy work of stoning a Christian to death, with a zeal worthy of first-century Jews. Stones were coming from all directions, I was getting some nasty blows, and had to defend my face with my hands. My probable ignominious fate flashed across my mind, stoned to death by children, the disclosures that would follow, the example I should be held up as. Suddenly one on the knee and another in the small of the back brought me down, when up again I did not know which way to turn. A pretty little Arab child was struggling to heave a rock he could scarcely lift. I made a rush, seized the squalling brat in my arms, and a run-up, rules, of about 20 yards brought me to a long wall, to which I turned my back and held the kicking little wretch before me as a shield. This bewildered my tormentors for a moment, then on they came again, led on by my kicked friend, to rescue young struggling Ibrahim, as I heard them call him. Poor little Ibrahim! Even when torn nearly limb from limb he looked a very pretty child, and I was sorry for him. The struggle was short and sharp. Ibrahim got terribly mauled, chiefly by his friends. I was somewhat of an old hand at a scrag and managed to keep from under the ruck, watched my chance, bolted off, and got about 20 yards start before I was missed and the pack set out in full cry after me. A Turkish guardhouse was close at hand, into which I rushed, past the sentry and squatted down behind him out of breath, arms and legs aching with bruises, and completely blown. However, I was safe for the moment and had time to pull myself together for what had become a very serious affair. In the meantime, a crowd of Arabs and Negroes were gathering outside, and the word, "a Christian," was being passed, and the Turkish guards were giving me very black looks. One of the soldiers went to bring an officer, and returned in a minute or two with a young lieutenant. Very spruce and civilized he looked. It was quite a relief to see him in his Paris-cut uniform. He came up to me, and at once addressed me in French, but I had got myself all there by this time, and artlessly replied, "I cannot speak Turkish," and proceeded on to declare that Allah was great, all praise be to Allah. There is only one God, Mohammed is his prophet, working myself up gradually till at last I rushed out of the guardhouse, saw an old friend, an Arab slave dealer, who in his negotiations with the Emperor had smoked many of my cigarettes, seized his stick and went for the promising young crowd with "sons of burnt fathers," and a torrent of similar abuse. The men now all took my side, and the old slave dealer laughingly apologized for the excess of zeal in the rising generation, though he could not help admiring it, while even the Turkish sentry helped to disperse the boys with a parting stone, and the lieutenant showed me out into a back way by which I could go home without any chance of being further annoyed. On my way home I strayed into a coffee shop to arrange my disordered robes, explaining that I had been thrown from my donkey which had bolted. After a smoke and a cup of coffee I began to feel a little more myself, and limped off home, getting stiffer all the time from bruises about the back and limbs. I had luckily no marks on my face, so that I was able to lie down as soon as I got into the house without any awkward questions being asked. My chief fear now was that the affair would get noised abroad in quarters where it would lead to my having a visit paid me by some inquisitive gentleman, whom I knew I should not be able to humbug, if once their suspicions were really aroused and they took to serious inquiries. The Arab to whom the house belonged came also that evening and gave us a good deal of trouble, trying to get us to turn out into a smaller room, so that he might have our larger and better situated one till the Emir's return, but I knew that the room had been paid for 2 months in advance, so would not turn out. Though the fellow was in an independent position, he was not above taking a luck penny, $1, and I was glad to get rid of him so cheap with a blessing backwards. To guard against this sort of thing I told my companions I was very sick, I really was in a good deal of pain, and that I would go and sleep in a little closet off the cooking room so as not to be disturbed by noise or visitors. Into this room about 8 feet by 4 I moved my clothes and blankets, and did not stir out of it till the Emir's return, about 3 weeks, during which there were many friendly inquiries for me. My companions stuck to me like bricks, giving out at my request that I had gone to Jeddah. I heard no more of the Christian row, and the third warrior was very much surprised and would scarcely believe it when I told him some time after what had happened, and although I insisted I knew more about Christians than he did, he would give me much interesting information about their beliefs and their neglect of certain ablutions. I was much edified to learn that their heaven was an eternal gorge of that animal's flesh and wine. My assurance and indiscretion had all but done for me, and now I must appear to have gone to the other extreme. It was not so much caution kept me confined the whole time as the ball of opium, a small pill of which I took the first night and continued to take every day, increasing the dose as I found it affecting me. I only ate 1 meal a day, brought me by the third warrior when he came to make up housekeeping accounts. He knew I was under opium and sympathized with me and could recommend nothing better, looking upon that drug as a specific for all maladies. I will not go into the pains and pleasures of opium eating more than to say the 3 weeks passed like 3 days. I was perfectly happy, everything appeared couleur de rose. Groups of devotees sitting under my window in the harem chanting La ilaha to Allah, over and over and over in a sing-song tuneful sort of no tune which had before been most distressing to listen to, would now transform themselves, in my waking dreams, into some merry English party, a picnic perhaps, and that La ilaha into La da da, the chorus of some charming unheard air. In short, I did not know a moment's discomfort the whole time. Our living averaged about $1 a day. Besides this we had rice, ghee, and tamarinds in the house, of which we consumed daily, rice, 8 pounds, ghee, 4 ounces, tamarinds, ½ pound. This is very sumptuous living indeed for Hindis, quite as good and more varied than we got at the Emir's table. I must not omit to mention little Ismail, an Arab boy whose acquaintance I had made at his father's place of business, in the bazaar near at hand, where I had often gone to talk to them. He was a very bright youth, spoke Hindustani well, and I had taken rather a fancy to him. Now that I was laid up I found him excellent company, and admitted him almost daily, amusing him greatly, telling him stories by the hour. Aesop's fables I found a capital fund of the very best material, and after them, other children's stories and nursery rhymes, changed of course to suit time and place, as it would not have done to have let him know the original of, "This little sheep went to market, this little sheep stopped at home," or he might not have laughed quite so gleefully at my rattletrap rhyme. For the opium had the effect of not only enabling me to converse incessantly but sometimes to improvise rhyme as fast as I could talk. Many travellers in the East, especially lady travellers, have had a good word to say for Eastern boys, and they are very attractive, I admit. This peculiar lovableness, for it is such, may be easily accounted for, as they have generally good features, many of them being remarkably handsome, and fine eyes are the rule. All have a feminine grace of manner and speech acquired in the harem, which is their home for the first 7 or 8 years of their lives. And there is also a downrightness and freedom from anything like affectation about them, when in the presence of strangers, which contrasts very favourably with the bashfulness of the nicey stereotyped English schoolboy, who has all individuality stamped out of him at a public school. Mohammedan children owe this to a primitive Hebrew innocence, there being hardly a word in their language which they may not freely use as occasion requires. To the pure all things are pure. With all this, however, they are intelligent to a degree, their intellectual faculties being very highly developed at an early age, and so far as simple learning and having an amount of knowledge, such as it is, in their heads, goes, they are certainly in advance of European children of their years, but by the time they are 14 they have attained the limits of an ordinary Mohammedan education. They read and write well in more than one language, do simple arithmetic, are perfectly instructed in all the minutest observances of their faith, and have an immense stock of religious lore, in which they take a deep interest and no little pride. For the manner in which the idea of the one God and antagonism to all other creeds is instilled into their minds goes down greatly with the youthful sinners, their little faces brighten up bravely as they declare the one God, and scowl savagely as they curse and defy the Kafir in a quite too amusing way. But after leaving the harem all their former attractiveness is soon rubbed off by rude intercourse with the men, and I know few creatures more unlovable than the Eastern in the transition stage from boy to man. He has all the obtrusive forwardness in the vulgar hobbledehoyhood everywhere, and rapidly cultivates the craftiness, low cunning, and brutal coarseness, those chief characteristics of manhood in the East. On the day before the new moon in December the M4 are returned loaded with purchases, crockery, glassware, and cutlery, from Cairo, jewelry, 2 guns, and a rifle, breech loading, from Alexandria, ornamental wood and stone, cups and saucers, cigarette cases, etc. from Jerusalem, altogether about half a ton of flashy French notions, and such news. Each one of the party seemed bent on overwhelming us with the wonders he had seen, the Suez Canal, the Opera, the Pashas and their beautiful carriages and horses, the splendid livery of their servants. "And what did the Pasha wear?" asked an old untravelled one, expecting to hear his dress compared to a rainbow. They could scarcely bring themselves to say it, but were obliged to confess that he'd had nothing on but a tarbouche. They had seen Mohammedans and Christians dressed so that you could not tell, but for the hat which was which, they had seen Christians working as labourers. This seemed to give them great satisfaction. They chewed over one to another, many beggarly Christians under the Sultan, much to my chagrin, for I knew they could not distinguish between a Greek and an Englishman. Travel had certainly not increased their respect for their rulers. I now felt perfectly safe while in the Amour's favour and recognized by him. I came out and began to move about, gave up opium suddenly, and found my nerves much affected in consequence. A stranger coming into the room would startle me. I dare not let anyone pass behind me, always backing up to the wall, and it was some days before this wore off. On the day of the new moon I was so ill, it being the day after I stopped my opium, that I was unable to pray, thereby missing much, for a prayer at Mecca on this day scores something enormous, though I forget exactly how many thousand rupees given in charity it is supposed to equal. I went about a good deal with the Amir now, and wore a less conspicuous dress, keeping more in the background. We paid a visit to the college, the scene of my unlucky encounter. The boys looked very sheepish, and pretended not to recognize me when they saw me in such good company, and you may be sure I let well alone. While in the courtyard, I heard a great squalling and crying going on in one of the rooms, and could not resist my curiosity to see what it was all about, so separated myself from my party, found my way to the door of the room and looked in, and saw a whole class of about 20 boys being punished. Half had already undergone the bastinado, and were sitting blubbering round the wall. 5 others were at the time getting it. 2 big boys held each one end of a thick stick, with a rope noose in the middle of it. Into this noose each of the culprits had to put 1 foot, then the stick was twisted round till the feet were squeezed up tightly into a bunch, which was then lifted breast high by the 2 assistant executioners, and a big Arab tutor came down on those wriggling toes with a Malacca cane, as hard as he could let out, showing no mercy. It seemed to be a very effective mode, judging by the yells, struggles, and brandishings of the disengaged limbs of the youngsters as they hung in a cluster head down. I saw by the unhappy looks of the rest of the class that the same was in store for them, and as some of my most vindictive assailants were there, I must say I did not pity them much, though I did not care to stay and witness their tortures. During the next few days I visited a number of shrines and holy places, the name of which is legion about Mecca, there being scarcely a spring or hill round, which is not said to be the scene of some remarkable event in the life of either Adam, Eve, Abraham, Hagar, Ishmael, or some other holy personage, while as for Mohammed, the lies that have been fathered upon him, honest man, would have made him take the dome off his Medina mausoleum in a great triple somersault, and snort the sides out of his shrine, if he had been there at all, a fact which there are other good reasons for doubting. "What are you picking up that stone for?" you inquire. "Oh, Mohammed was fighting infidels, and God sent angels and a shower, etc., etc. Why are you eating that shrub?" "Oh, this is called the Prophet's bread. Mohammed and his companions were starving in the desert and he told them to take this, etc., etc. Rocks, pools, holes in the ground, she-camels, dogs, cats, rats, mice, Mohammed, 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 Mohammed. I used to find a quiet place and sit down and say over all the swearing I knew in 5 languages, and make resolutions that if I ever got out of this and met a white man who said he believed in miracles, I would go and get a gun and shoot him. Why, if Mohammed had been actively employed since the year 1 of the Hejra to the present day, performing the marvels attributed to him, he would still have a few legerdemain trifles, in milk and mud, on hand. No, nonsense apart, it cannot be established that Mohammed ever openly attempted to dupe his followers with one single miracle. These supernatural wonders are the accumulated imaginings of marvel-craving Eastern minds, the more ignorant the more fertile in the like. Not one of my companions but was perfectly well acquainted with the minutest circumstances of 6 miracles of yesterday, or who had not been eye-witness to at least one. Only a year before the Amar's uncle had been present when 6 laden camels were either eaten up by the earth or carried off to the zenith, the work of the devil, who appeared in the form of a dog. We are not living in an age of miracles. Are we not one come to the Eastern Sea, or for the matter of that, not so very far east either, for the genuine article? Such of these places as I did visit I will now attempt to describe. First, the harem itself, of which I have already given a view from the top of Jebel Kubris, shall be more minutely described. The Kaaba, in the middle of that enclosure, is called the center of the world, the Mohammedan hub of the universe. Towards this Mohammedans in all parts of the earth face when praying. The whole ground within the outer bounds of the arcades is deemed part of heaven on earth, to which it will return on the last day. The architectural design of the whole is such that I know of no other structure 74 or edifice familiar to Europeans with which to compare it. The same form of mosque may be seen in Cairo and some other places in the East, but if, as I hope, I have already given the reader a general idea of its form, I may now succeed in conveying some notion of its appearance on closer inspection. It is entered from the street by doorways of different sizes. The 2 largest are on the northern and western sides, the Gate of Abraham in the western being very high and arched, and really fine. There are a dozen or more other public entrances and a number of smaller private doorways and windows into the offices of the harem and adjoining dwellings. The tower being some 10 feet above the level of the square, you descend, at all the entrances, either a steep paved incline, a flight of steps, or an irregular compound of both, into the arcades, which are about 50 feet wide and paved throughout with limestone and a greenish crystalline stone common in the neighborhood, laid very unevenly and in small oblong blocks, none of them bigger than could be conveniently carried by a man. The roof is supported on 3 rows of 36 pillars on the longer and 24 pillars on the shorter sides, each 16 feet apart. Every fourth pillar is an hexagonal built support about 4 feet thick, the rest are plain round pillars something more than a foot in diameter, composed generally of either sandstone or limestone. The capitals of these are the only ornamental stonework in the building. They are carved with flower, scroll, or angular devices, respectively and promiscuously. The roof consists of rows of arches, 36 on the longer and 24 on the shorter sides longitudinally, and all round 3 arches transversely springing from every pillar throughout, dividing the ceiling into 3 rows of small domes, except at the corners, where the architect seems to have got confused, tried to round them off, failed, and so bungled them up anyhow, and at the principal portals, where ingenious, bewildering non-uniformity baffles description. From the top of each transverse arch a large globe lamp is suspended by a brass chain, and all round under the inner row of arches facing towards the Kaaba there hang from a crossbar, reaching from pillar to pillar, 5 lamps to each arch. The square itself is gravelled and divided by narrow pavements into a sort of a Union Jack pattern. There are 3 bronze date trees, about 12 feet high, with lamps hanging, to the ends of their fronds equidistant from one another, and midway between the Kaaba and the arcades, across the eastern and western ends of the square. All round on the gravel at intervals are placed stacks of earthenware bottles containing water of Zam-Zam for the use of the pilgrims. The well Zam-Zam is about 80 feet from the northeast corner of the Kaaba. It has an irregular shambling building over it, roofed by a large cupola, a small dome, and a couple of sections of a pagoda, and probably occupying an area of about 70 feet square. On the eastern, western, and southern sides of the Kaaba, at about the same distance as the well, are 3 other unimportant erections with rather more than their share of lamps. On the northern side, about 30 feet distant, Abraham's stone is deposited in a small house 10 feet high by 6 by 8 feet square, having a large heavy wooden door on its north side. This is the stone which acted as a stage for Abraham when building the Kaaba, passing up and down to and from the work as required with any weight of workman or material. I did not see the stone, as it can only be seen by paying very highly, and few can afford it, but it is popularly believed to have Abraham's footprint on it, another of the many like impressions Eastern celebrities seem to have been so fond of leaving. About 8 yards off on each side of this building there are 2 stone pulpits, plain hexagonal pedestals, 3 feet thick and 12 feet high, topped with a stone railing and mounted by a set of stone steps on the opposite side to that facing the Kaaba. At each of these pulpits commences a row of lampposts about 10 feet high extending all round the Kaaba about 15 feet distant from one another, and having between each 2 posts 7 lamps suspended from crossbars, each post being surmounted by a gilded crescent. Outside this circle the pavement extends about 20 feet, and is the same as that under the arches, while that within the circle of lamps is a pavement composed of smooth flagstones about 18 inches below the level of the square. On the western side of the Kaaba is a horseshoe wall 4.5 feet high and 3 feet thick, its ends towards the Kaaba, leaving a passage between, enclosing a semicircular space 30 feet in diameter, in the middle of which is the tomb of Ishmael with an engraved slab of marble over it. The base of the Kaaba is surrounded by a marble rim or half round about 2.5 feet wide and 1 foot high, and into this a number of brass ring bolts are let, having a 4-inch cotton rope passed through them, to which the lower edge of the Kaaba cover is laced. There are 3 openings in this cove one in the east end of the north side is a heavy bullioned curtain before the silver-plated door in the Kaaba, which is of ordinary size, about 7 feet from the ground, near this, but right on the corner of the building, is a round hole in the cover about 5 feet in circumference, and its lower border about 2 feet above the base rim of the Kaaba, showing a massive silver boss, with ears for securing it to the stonework, and set so deeply into this that the face is concealed by the silver rim when in the act of kissing it, is the black stone. This is about the size of a man's head, of a brownish-black, glassy substance, presenting rounded inequalities of surface, as if from fusion or fracture. There is a piece of obsidian from Hekla in the British Museum, its exact counterpart in shape and appearance, but about 3 times its bulk. So closely do they resemble one another, that after having carefully inspected both, and I lived for 4 months in sight of the black stone, I have no doubt whatever that the 2 are identical in substance. If I required anything to confirm the evidence of my senses, there is a belief that the black stone will float in water. This most likely means that it is momentarily buoyant after being thrown in, which might be true if it contained a great number of cavities or bubbles, as a piece of obsidian often does. And another general belief is that the stone is white, but that its surface has been blackened by defilement, which led me to break the agate in a ring I were in order to test it with a scratch, but the result showed it to be white like any other piece of colored glass. There are 2 or 3 versions of the history of this stone, but the most generally received one is that it is the angel who had charge of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden turned into stone for allowing them to be beguiled by the serpent into eating the wheat, and that he will be restored at the last day. In the southeast corner of the Kaaba there is another piece cut out of the cover about 3 feet high and 18 inches wide, exposing one of the cornerstones of the building, a small oblong granite block, very much polished by the touchings it receives at the hands of the pilgrims every circuit, while performing the tawaf. On the west side from the top of the Kaaba is a gold-plated spout, appearing from below to project about 4 feet from the building, to be about 1 foot wide and 6 inches high at the sides. The rainwater off the flat roof of the Kaaba is discharged through this, and when it rains 80 there is a free fight among the pilgrims to get under it and be douched. Considering the open-air character and the dimensions of the whole, the place is kept in a good state of order and repair, the whitewash and paint all appearing fresh and clean. The colors employed are black, mauve, Indian red, and yellow wash, each stone on the inside and much of the outer walls being painted one of these colors with, as it were, a system of avoiding anything like rule. There are also large whitewashed spaces on these walls occupied with chapters of the Quran, and the stones of the arches are painted like those in the walls, as are the stones in built pillars. The domed ceiling is cleanly whitewashed, and the plaster on the top and front of the arcades and buildings is kept in constant repair, while the whole place is cleaned out by gangs of sweepers twice a day, morning and evening. The reader will not have gathered from all these details the fine simplicity of the whole until reminded that the building occupies within its outer walls a space of 8 1/4 acres. The behavior in the harem is much better than in most other Mohammedan mosques. During the day crowds sit about or promenade under the shade of the arcades until a call to prayer, when all join in the regular worship lasting for about 1/4 of an hour, more or less, the noonday prayer being the longest. After sunset the lamps, 2860 in number, are lit, and many groups of pilgrims sit round private colored lamps, which add greatly to the general brilliancy, until after the last evening prayer, when the harem becomes deserted, no one being permitted to sleep inside the gates, and all who are not actually employed in performing some act of prayer or devotion are turned out after this hour by the attendants of the harem. Jebel Nur, lying about 4 miles northeast of Mecca, is a steep conical hill rising some 900 feet above the sand level, for the sand in the valley maintains a level of its own as water would. Looking at Jebel Nur from the south, it appears to be inaccessible from about 2/3 of the way up, the upper part seeming to be one solid oval rock, its sides projecting beyond the perpendicular, but in the ascent, having reached this point, you pass round to the north side, where you see that it would have been impossible to ascend so far on that side, but find a somewhat difficult though perfectly practicable path leading to the summit. Halfway up this path there is a rainpool in the rock, generally full at this season. Here you may perform your ablutions before ascending to the very apex of the cone, where a small dome is erected, over a fissure in the solid rocks, some 8 feet long by 3 feet deep, said to have been made by a slip of the angel Gabriel's delicate instrument, while performing the somewhat nice operation of removing the black spot, sin, from the heart of Mohammed preparatory to giving him his prophet's commission. There Mohammed received his first inspired message. Farther down on the south side are 2 small caves, in which Mohammed concealed himself at the time of his persecution in Mecca. Into one of these, when being pursued, Mohammed had just time to escape ere his pursuers came up and found a pigeon sitting over its nest at the entrance, and a spider's web woven across the mouth of the cave, a miraculous interposition which led them to believe that no one had entered lately. In the other cave, Mohammed and his friend Abubakar were sleeping concealed, when Abubakar awakening saw a serpent putting its head out of a hole to bite Mohammed. Farther than awake the Prophet he put his own heel over the hole and was bitten. When Mohammed awoke he found his friend still keeping the serpent back with his heel, but nearly dead, whereupon he of course killed the serpent and cured his friend by a miracle. Both these events are generally said to have taken place on Jebel Sur, 83 another mountain to the southeast of Mecca, but I and my companions related these stories to one another in the very caves I speak of as having occurred in them. Umrah lies in a valley, about 4 miles southeast of Mecca, is a deep pool or janlo, built round, about 100 feet by 50 feet square. There are steps leading down to the water, in which the pilgrims wash, and it is looked upon as a sort of pool of Siloam. This is said to have been one of Mohammed's favorite places of resort for prayer and meditation. He is said to have prayed there so long that his knees became stiff and hard and his muscles rigid. Most Arab and Hindi, i.e. stockingless, Mohammedans have a callosity on the outside of the left ankle, the effect of one of the most constant attitudes of prayer, sitting with the left foot tucked under them. At all these places, and many others, the pilgrim may say a two-prostration prayer, and dole out his charity to the inevitable irrepressible Hijaz beggar. These beggars may be classed under two heads, the pauper pilgrim and the professional beggar. In Mecca the pauper pilgrim falls into obscurity, and so may be dropped for the present. The professional beggar luxuriates simply, and probably forms half 84. The Arab population. Bakshish, bakshish, they continually do cry. Bakshish, roars the camel, bakshish, brays the ass, bakshish, yelps the cur, till, after passing through a stage where you fancy you hear nothing else, you get so accustomed to it that it costs you an effort of will to hear it. It is encouraged by the pilgrims, who make it a means of carrying out the letter of the Prophet's charitable commands, true generosity not being an Eastern trait. A large proportion of these beggars are Hindi, Turkish or Persian beggars being comparatively few, and a Malay beggar is never seen. Every day all who will take the trouble to go can receive for the asking a bowl of soup, given by the High Shia F, the hereditary head curl and religious authority of Mecca, who is assisted in administration by the Mufti, Qadis, and a council of mullahs under the Turkish Pasha, or governor, to whom final appeals in all disputed cases are brought. The Turks can only be said to hold the country in military possession, garrisoning the towns and maintaining order in them. They have no control over the desert men, to whom they yearly pay a reluctant subsidy, which they have from time to time attempted to stop, but the tribes have thereupon 85 become unmanageable and closed the roads, and the Turks have found it expedient to continue payment. It now wanted but 2 days to the going out to Mount Arafat. At this time, about 6 feet of the lower part of the Kaaba cover, which had become very ragged by pilgrims leaning against it, was raised all round and replaced by white calico, adding greatly to the effect by contrast with the black and gold. Pilgrims were now arriving in crowds, all the great caravans had come in, the town was packed till there was scarcely standing room in some of the streets. I have only seen such dense crowding in such places as Gracechurch Street on a Lord Mayor's show day. The crowd here, however, was very different. Everyone here was all yielding affability. The London rough, who thinks it the height of pleasantry to knock a gentleman's hat over his eyes, or jump on a lady's feet and tender the horsey advice of sit hun eid when she faints, had no representative here. Quarrelling of any kind is seldom seen in the streets, which is very creditable, considering the number of different nationalities and sects brought into close contact here, who elsewhere entertain the bitterest animosity against one another. During the whole of my stay in Mecca, I only once saw serious fighting in the streets. 2 Punjabis, tearing mad, were scratching and slapping one another when one of the Turkish soldiers, who do police duty about the streets, went up to separate them. One of them turned on the Turk and slapped him. The Turk drew his sword bayonet and smote the Punjabi a swinging slash on the neck, cutting the head half off. Turkish soldiers are never allowed out of barracks without their swords, which are always carried sharp.